Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh and I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment. So welcome along. There's a few names that I recognise on the attendee list, so good afternoon if we've met before, and indeed good afternoon if we haven't. The webinar is scheduled to take about an hour. If it's like previous ones I've delivered, I tend to probably overrun ever so slightly. So the plan is for me to talk for about 45-50 minutes and then a section for questions at the end. However, you should on the screen in front of you have a dialog box that talks about the webinar and gives you some options. On there should be a box that allows you to ask questions. As we go along, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to do so. I'll either take them there and then if it's relevant to what I'm talking about, or I might hold fire and cover it at the end if it's something that we've already discussed. Couple of things just to save you panicking a little bit. There's no need to frantically scribble down everything I'm saying. Two things: you will get a copy of the presentation, a PDF version of all the slides emailed to you probably now, early to mid next week. It is Friday, of course, so it's unlikely to be this afternoon. And we also record all of these webinars. So this webinar and previous webinars will also appear on our YouTube channel. If you know how to get onto YouTube, go into channels and search for NQA, and there we are. And this webinar and others, both energy, environment, health and safety, quality, all the other webinars are available for you to look at. So as I say, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, the things we're going to cover, as you can see there, a little bit about the new concepts. So this is a transition webinar, just to make sure you're all hearing what you expect to be hearing. We're looking at the new 2018 version of ISO 50001. So that's what we're here for, and hopefully by the end you'll have a better understanding of the standard and a little bit of an idea about the clauses and also a bit about our NQA transition process if you are an NQA client. But if you're not, it's still relevant because everybody else should be transitioning in the same way. So we're going to look at the standard itself, look at some new terminology and some important definitions. The bulk of the presentation will be going through the clauses themselves, looking at what they mean, looking at what the requirements are, and importantly from our perspective, and I guess for yours, what we as a certification body will expect to see when you transition. Look at the transition timelines and a couple of notable dates, and then a little bit at the end on some practical tips from me on how best to prepare for the changes and the implications of those, and then maintaining your certification. All of the new standards that have been published recently, all the new management system standards, so that'll be 14,001, 9,001, the new 45,001 standard for health and safety, and indeed this standard, all are set out in what's known as the Annex SL format. And that was a blank standard, if you like, a framework for all the new standards that was published, I'm guessing 6 or 7 years ago now. And all of these new standards are meant to fit in, if you like, with this structure, which is there to ease, if you like, the integration. So all of the new standards have an intended outcome, and it's always the continual improvement in either quality, environment, health and safety, or in this case, energy performance. And as we'll see a little bit later on, there's a couple of special issues around continuation of energy performance with this standard. So it's all about fulfilling compliance obligations. That's again across all of the standards. So any obligations to place upon you, either legislatively or otherwise, have to be complied with. And also in this case, specifically achievement of the energy objectives. The new standards also have a greater emphasis on planning process, planning for change, management of risk. And as I say, the whole idea is that they're all easily integrated with each other. So where did the standard come from? Energy standards have been around getting on for 15 years now. But the real sort of management system launch in a familiar way of looking at it, something that we will be familiar with, came around probably getting on for 10 years ago now, when it was a British standard, but it also had European status. BSEN 16001 was published in 2009. It didn't take ISO too long to catch up, and in 2011, the old version of 50001 now, and a lot of people are still certified to that at the moment, was published in 2011. That obviously wasn't in the Annex SL format, tended to be mirrored, if you like, to the old 14001 2004 standard. So that standard was changed, and as we can see there, in 2018, on the 21st of August 2018, ISO 50001 2018 was launched. It was produced as a draft in 2017, but it actually was produced in 2018, 21st of August. Now, the standard transition period, as has been with all of these standards, the transition period is 3 years from the date of publication. So we are what, 12, 14 months now into the transition period, and technically you have right the way through to the 20th of August 2021 to make that transition. We're running a training program now. All our energy assessors have been trained by me, and they are all now up to speed and are capable and able of delivering certification to the new standard. And this webinar forms a part of not just client, but training, if you like, for anybody who cares to spare an hour and sit and listen to my dulcet tones over maybe lunchtime, as it is today. So this is where we are. At the moment, you can start that transition at any time, and so long as you've made the transition by the 20th of August, that's fine. If you haven't done anything, then your certificates, whatever the date is on them, your certificates will expire. The 2011 versions of the certificates will expire on the 20th of August 2021. Just a point I'd like to make here, we can and will be continuing to do surveillance visits against the old standard right the way through to almost to the end. A number of certification bodies have said that after 18 months they will stop doing any surveillance visits to the old standard. That is actually that's maybe their position. That is actually technically incorrect. What we are doing from the end of this year, more or less, anybody coming along wanting certification from scratch really will need to be starting out now using this new standard, the 2018 standard. Technically, it's possible to still be certified to the old standard as a stage 1 and stage 2, but we would strongly advise against that. And indeed, a number of clients I'm currently working with, been doing a couple of stage 2s this week, are all being certified to the 2018 standard. All of these standards continually change, they're continually updated. That's not just to keep people at ISO in a job, but the standards tend to change to maintain their relevance to both industry and any other organisations. And it's expected that this particular standard may well be around for the next 6, 7, possibly up to 10 years. It shouldn't take that long, but usually if you think about the ISO 14001 transition, that went from 2004 through to 2015, so that was an 11-year gap. This standard has gone from 2011 to 2018, so that's 7 years. So therefore, this standard is going to be around for quite a while, but it's going to provide a consistent foundation for all businesses that are seeking to use a management system to improve their energy performance. Again, standards tend to change because they need to reflect the increasingly complex environments in which we operate. And I think it's fair to say that going back to when I first started looking at energy management systems back in about 2008, 2009, things have moved on an awful lot in those 10, 11 years, and I expect in 10, 11 years' time, things will have moved on even more. I may not be around at NQA in 11 years' time, who knows, but things will certainly have moved on over that period of time. One of the main reasons for using this Annex SL format is that there was a push from industry for easier integration to try and get all of these management systems so that they are all easily interchangeable and can sit together. And this standard has more or less stuck to Annex SL. I say more or less because rather annoyingly, there's a couple of areas where it's drifted away from that, and we'll look at that as we move along. However, if you're wanting to integrate this standard into an ISO 14001 2015 standard, don't worry. You can use the ISO 14001 Annex SL format and build this standard around that, and it won't cause any problems. We are very clear about that, as should be any other certification bodies. So that's the Annex SL format for those people who maybe who haven't seen this before. And all of these standards now have 10 clauses. The clauses we're interested in are what we call the auditable clauses, and those are clauses 4 to 10. And as I say, looking at those clauses will be the bulk of this presentation. Clauses 1, 2, and 3 are an introduction. Scope, by the way, isn't the scope of your management system, it is the scope of the standard itself, and sets out what the standard is all about, what it's trying to achieve, etc., etc. So we're going to be looking, we're going to be looking over the next sort of 35 minutes, 40 minutes perhaps, about those clauses. At the moment, nobody asked any questions. That's fine, and I wasn't expecting any just yet. But just a reminder that we can take questions as we're going through the presentation, if anybody wishes to ask any. Okay, moving on then. So that is the structure of the standard, if you like, set out in the Plan, Do, Check, Act. That's where all of these standards are set out. And that's the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the Deming cycle, if you happen to be interested in quality. But that's the Deming cycle with the clauses of the standard set out. I tend to prefer to see it looking like this. Whether it's got from a man, I don't know. I prefer to see things set out in a linear fashion. And this is the same Plan, Do, Check, Act with the clauses and the relevant sub-clauses along there. So the blue bits are plan, the bit in green is doing, that's the operational bits, checking, performance evaluation, and then acting is the improvement bit right towards the end. And as I say, we're going to be going through and looking at all of those areas. As I said earlier, it's easily integratable. That's the idea, and it can sit with any of those. I have clients that have just got 14 and 50. I've got clients that have got all 4 standards there, and there's no particular order. Generally, if I'm honest, people tend to do 14,001 and then add on 50,001, although I was with a client doing a stage 1 earlier this week that are going the other way around. They've got 50,001 in place already, and they've now decided they wish to add on 14,001 to that certification. So it doesn't really matter, but all of the standards are easily integrated and sort of have the similar format, similar structure as we've seen. One of the questions I sometimes get asked, both when I'm doing training and also in some cases on certification visits, when people maybe are thinking about doing 50,001 and they've already got 14,001 in place, maybe sort of a lunchtime discussion over a sandwich, is how does 50,001 sit alongside 14,001? And quite legitimately, they ask the question, if we've already got an environmental management system in place, and of course energy is included in that, why do we really need 50,001? Is it not duplicating the effort? And I can see the point, I can see where people might come from. However, 50,001 does focus singly on energy performance improvements, whereas 14,001 energy is a part of the much wider significant environmental impacts of an organisation. And as I said, both standards can be implemented separately or integrated with each other. What we tend to say is that if in a 14,001 system energy usage comes out pretty high on the list of environmental aspects, then maybe 50,001 is appropriate, because it, as I say, it does look in much more detail, takes the sort of energy management element of 14,001 to a much higher level. But ultimately, the two standards complement each other and not compete with each other. Now, a couple of areas just to explain on a couple of terms and definitions. Again, these are common across the whole suite of the new standards. So correction is now defined as actions to eliminate a detected non-conformity. Corrective action, obviously follows on from correction, is action to eliminate the cause of a detective non-conformity. And then the term preventive action has been dropped from all of these standards. It is now accepted that clause 6, which is the planning clause, which is where you plan to take action, plan to address risks and opportunities, that planning section is now the actual preventive action section. It doesn't use that term anymore. It talks about planning to address risks and opportunities, but that is considered to be now the preventive action. I do have clients that still talk about preventive action, and you can call things whatever you like, really, but generally preventive action is a term that's not used anymore. And then finally, energy performance. Now, one of the key things that I find, and again, one of the clients I was with this week, at the moment, they're just measuring absolute energy usage, not energy performance. And energy performance is defined as measurable results related to energy efficiency, use, and consumption. Now, you could argue that absolute energy usage this year we've used 500,000 kilowatt hours. Next year we're planning to use a bit less than that, maybe 450,000 kilowatt hours. That is a reduction in real terms. But sometimes legitimately energy usage goes up. You may decide to put on an extra shift in your manufacturing site. You may have more people in the office. Therefore, you're going to use more energy, and energy usage has gone up. However, energy performance is the amount of energy you're using factored against something else. So it might be kilowatt hours per staff member in the office. It might be kilowatt hours used to produce a particular output within the factory. So therefore, as production goes up, then energy usage will go up, but you still have a measurable performance target that you can work towards. We're going to cover that in a little bit more detail later on. So starting with the clauses, we're going to start at clause 4.1 and keep going till we get to the end. So clause 4.1, if you've already got 14,001, 9,001, you'll be familiar with this clause. This clause is all about the context of the organisation. And if you've got 14,001 particularly, then if I'm honest, 90% of what you already need is already in place. And it's a case of looking at how that might need to be amended, tweaked, if you like, to take into account a little bit more detail on energy. But it's all about determining the external and internal issues that are relevant to what you do, that can affect your ability to achieve the intended outcome of the management system, the energy management system. Now, remember back at the start, I said that the intended outcome is the improvement or continual improvement in energy performance. Put simply, context is all about, there are things out there, both outside in the outside world and within your own organisation. There are things that are going to help you achieve that, and there are things that are going to get in the way. There are things that are going to be beneficial, and there are things that might have a negative impact on trying to achieve that energy performance improvement. And what it's all about, this clause, is all about making sure that the things that are going to help you are maximised, and the things that are going to get in the way are mitigated. And that is probably the best definition I can give you on risks and opportunities. And it's about maximising the opportunities and mitigating the risks. So this clause is all about considering the organisation's context and the areas that, as I just said, can help or hinder. And it's all about making sure that the management system, as it's documented, does actually focus on the issues that present the greatest risks. The standard talks about positive or negative risks, but generally we talk about risks and opportunities. A positive risk is an opportunity. It's all about making sure that you focus on the things that you need to focus on. People always say, what sort of things should I cover? This is nowhere near a complete list. This is just a starter for 10, if you like, a few potential key issues. So we talk about, I like to see them split into these three. You can split them up however you like. Some people do a pestle analysis. Some people do risk analysis. I've seen people do SWOT analysis, all sorts of different ways of doing it. I think it fits quite nicely into these three categories: energy related things, availability of energy supply, the weather, climate change issues, greenhouse gas emissions, maybe objectives of the sector that you're in, external, so those are other things that are out there, economic, legal, regulatory. I think just about every single one I see at the moment's got Brexit on there. Less said about that the better just at the moment, but generally we've got the external areas, and then we've got internal areas, the company, our own company, what's our strategic direction, what capabilities have we got, what's our culture, what other standards have we got in place, etc., etc. Ultimately, the intent of all of this is to provide a high level understanding of the issues that can positively or negatively affect the way in which you're going to manage, or you currently manage, your energy responsibilities. Tied in with that is interested parties. And this is all about understanding who has an interest in our energy performance, specifically in this instance, although with 14,001, of course, it's environmental. So who has an interest in what we do, and what are those relevant requirements? And then for us to determine, say us as in you, not me as a certification assessor, it's for you to then determine which ones that your organisation has to comply with. And you can choose that, with one key exception, of course. You can't choose to ignore legislative issues. So as an absolute minimum, all relevant legal requirements must be included and reviewed at defined intervals. Now, this is one of the areas where Annex SL has where this standard rather has slightly drifted away from the Annex SL format. In 14,001, clause 613 is headed compliance obligations, and they could have just used that clause, lifted it straight across, and almost word for word inserted it into 50,001 2018. For reasons unbeknown to me, and seemingly to defy logic, they chose to ignore that way forward and decided to tuck compliance obligations away in this clause on interested parties. Because legitimately, regulators are an interested party. However, 14,001 saw fit to have a separate clause on compliance obligations. This standard didn't. There is, interestingly, towards the end of this standard, a clause on evaluation of compliance. So, this standard has used the term legal and other requirements, which the old standards used to use, but which the new standards tend to have drifted towards using the term compliance obligations. You can call things what you like. However, what I've been saying to our staff and to people who I've been working with on this, if you've already got 14,001 and you are using the 14,001 way of managing this, so to have a legal register, to call them compliance obligations, but to have an energy section within that, that's quite acceptable. And although this standard treats it slightly differently, it doesn't make a scrap of difference how you comply. The 14,001 way of doing it is equally acceptable. You don't have to do it in the way that this standard is suggesting, so long as you are aware of the legal requirements and the other requirements that are non-legislative obligations, if you like. So long as you're aware of them, got them detailed somewhere, that will tick the box. Not that obviously assessments are a box ticking exercise. Again, just a little bit of an idea there about who the interested parties may be. Fairly standard. You've probably seen this before. Stakeholders, we might call them as well. Employees, board members, shareholders, customers, suppliers, contractors, the regulator we've just been talking about, and interestingly, bearing in mind what seems to be happening in London at the moment, particularly around pressure groups and the wider community. Basically, anybody who can show they have a legitimate interest in what you're doing. Clause 4.3, scope of the management system. This is all about looking at what you're going to include within the system itself, and ultimately will affect the wording that appears on your management system certificate. You can choose to certify all the organisation, or you can choose to certify a part of that organisation. It's up to you. However, and it might be a little bit late in the day if you haven't started this now, if you're using 50,001 for ESOS compliance, then it must include at least 90% of your total energy use. However, there's a couple of new areas that have popped up in the requirements for the scope in this new standard. The scope must include all energy types that are used. So for instance, if you have a fleet of company cars and you're buying petrol or diesel for those cars via fuel cards or however, you cannot exclude that, because you would then be excluding an energy type. So you must include within the scope all the different types of energy that are used. You can't decide to keep an area out of the scope because it's an energy type you wish to ignore. That doesn't happen or can't happen. And then the other slightly confusing area now is this little bit about must have authority to control energy efficiency, use and consumption within the scope. So what this is basically saying here is that you must have, as the bullet point says, that ability to be able to control your own energy efficiency. It's becoming increasingly harder to look at this now, and without mentioning any names, the organisation I was with yesterday in Birmingham is in a fully managed office. They have 2 floors of an office. Their heating and cooling comes through an office-wide or a building-wide air handling system. They don't have any access. They're not given any billing. They're not given any energy usage figures for heating and cooling. It's all inclusive within their rent. There is sub-metering for electricity usage on the floor, so plug sockets and the like, but there isn't for lighting, heating and cooling. Now, I would argue, and we had a discussion about this with the client, I would argue that they do have the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use and energy consumption. They can alter the heating and they can turn lights on and off and they can unplug equipment. So that, in my mind, is sufficient. But it is becoming a little bit more complicated sometimes when people are in fully managed offices, to just bear that in mind when we're talking about the scope of the system. Right, so moving on, final bit of this first clause, clause 4, the management system itself, and it says we have to establish, implement, maintain and continually improve the management system itself. All these new standards require that you improve the system to make sure that we achieve our intended outcomes and we know what those intended outcomes are. Okay, moving on, leadership and commitment. So again, all the standards have a new clause now. The clause is called leadership, and it's about making sure that the company management, if you like, at the highest level are actively involved and do provide leadership. And this is taken more or less directly from the standard to make sure that the system is not managed in isolation, that the system is considered when strategic business decisions are made, is aligned so the system doesn't compete, if you like, with business objectives, is given the appropriate level of resources. I tend to put that in here. It's actually in clause 7.1 is resource provision, but I think it's a leadership function, so I've included it here as well. That it does receive appropriate involvement from across the business, that there is this culture of promoting continual improvement in energy efficiency and in the management system itself, and to ensure that the designated or the set performance indicators appropriately represent energy performance. This is again common to all of the standards. Top management defined as people or a group of people or an individual who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. If by chance you have chosen to just work with one area of the business, maybe one site, and this happens with a particular client they have a site in the East Midlands, and it is only really that one site that is certified at the moment, then in terms of top management, we're talking about the person who manages that individual site, although there is a dotted line of responsibility to the energy management team that actually sit away from that site. However, the standard does require that top management person or that top management group to take full accountability for the effectiveness of the system. The standard requires a policy, just as the same way that we have an environmental policy, a quality policy, a health and safety policy. And again, it's fairly standard stuff that's in there. Draw your attention to just a couple of things that maybe don't sit in with some of the other policies. It has to commit to ensure the availability of information and necessary resources to achieve objectives and energy targets. That's one. And also has to commit, this is across them all, but has to commit to continual improvement of the energy management system. The biggest finding by far that I raise against policies is forgetting to put in that commitment to continual improvement of the management system. That's got to be in there, and we can't do anything. That would be a non-conformance, and indeed the policy I was looking at yesterday didn't have that commitment in it, and I always found it rather strange, because if you read the standard, there's about 6 or 7 bullet points that say it must say this, 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 and this, and it's not rocket science to make sure that it does say it. However, it didn't, and consequently they got a finding. Roles, responsibilities, authorities, and as I say, I've added in a little bit on resources. As with all of the standards, there is now no requirement for an energy manager. 14,001 doesn't require an environmental manager, and so on and so forth. However, the standard does require, which is a little bit different from the other standards, the standard does require the setting up of an energy team. That is a requirement. Now, I have been asked the question, can it be a team of one? I would view that quite dimly, I think, because the idea of having an energy team is that it draws together different people from across the business who will have an input into how we use energy. So whether that's a maintenance team, whether it's facilities management, whether it's sales, marketing, purchasing, whoever, really it's trying to pull together all the interested parties within the business in terms of setting up an energy management team. So we said that clause 6 had sort of replaced preventive action, and yes it does, and it's all about planning, and this clause is dedicated to planning to achieve or planning to address the issues that we've raised within the context, if you like, start earlier on. So that's why at the beginning of this slide you'll see it says plan to address the issues for clauses 4.1 and 4.2 within the EnMS that are needed to achieve the intended outcome. So in other words, this is now where we take those opportunities and risks, those things that we need to improve on and the things that we need to mitigate, and we start to plan how we're actually going to do something about it. And we have to make sure, just as a reminder, that we achieve continual improvement in energy performance. And it's about preventing or reducing undesired effects, and also then maximizing on the things that can help us. But it's all about making sure that we plan to achieve continual improvement in our energy performance. So we have to plan on how we're going to address these identified risks and opportunities, and make sure that we integrate them into our system, and also evaluate ultimately the effectiveness of the things we said we're going to do. Sitting alongside that is the the requirement, the formal requirement to set energy objectives. And as I say, interestingly, whilst the other standards have dropped the term target, all the other standards now talk about objectives and planning to achieve them. The people that wrote this decided to plough their own furrow, if you like, and have stuck with the term objectives and targets. Doesn't matter. I have people I audit on 14,001 that still refer to targets, and as I say, call things what you like. It doesn't matter to me. So it is a policy commitment. The policy does commit to setting and achieving objectives. So this is what it's all about. So the objectives have got to be consistent with the policy. They've got to be measurable, if we can. We have to consider within the objectives are significant energy uses. So significant energy uses are the energy version of significant aspects. And again, we'll look at those shortly. We have to monitor them, we have to communicate the objectives, and they have to be updated regularly. So for each objective, we need to plan how we're going to achieve it, and that's all about who, what, when, what resources are we going to need, how are we going to evaluate it, what indicators are we going to use, and also to plan how we're going to integrate the achievement of that target into our business processes. Now, in the same way that within 14,001, we go through and look at aspects and impacts evaluation, and we look at how we're impacting on the environment, the things that we're doing that can have an impact, and what that impact actually is. 50,001 asks us to go through a similar process, but it calls it an energy review. So the energy review is analysing what energy we're using, what types of energy we're using, and how we're using it, where it's being used. But we have to look at past energy performance, current energy performance, and jumping quickly to the last bullet point, to look forward and try and anticipate what our future energy requirements are going to be. So it's looking at identifying significant energy uses, and the significant energy use is a process or element of the business that uses a significant amount of energy. And for those significant energy uses, we then have to determine what is the key variable. So the key variables are the things that will have the greatest impact on what we actually do and how much energy we use. So the easiest one, for instance, if we're looking at heating, if I was to ask you what is the biggest factor that affects how much we spend on heating, hopefully you would all come rushing back to me and shout out all in unison, the weather. So therefore, temperature is the key variable that affects how much heating we use. It may be, if we are looking at, as another example, maybe a powder coating oven or an oven used in our process, the biggest thing that's going to affect that is how much work we put through it. So we need to identify what the key variables are. And those key variables we then use in a couple of clauses' time to set the performance indicators. So for energy usage in an office, for instance, the number of people in that office will have a bearing. So therefore you might decide, as an example I used earlier, that one of the things you're going to look at is kilowatt hours of electricity per staff member. So that's the energy review. It needs to be updated. It's not a once in a lifetime process, if you like, just in the same way that we come back in 14,001 and review our environmental aspects if something changes. So likewise, if the business changes, if the activities change, if our shift patterns change, if we put up an extension on the side of the building, whatever it is, then we have to go back and revisit the energy review. However, the standard does say that you have to document. Can't just sit there and somebody tell us how you've done it. There has to be a documented methodology on how you will carry out the energy review. So there must be a procedure or a document of some sort of flowchart, call it what you will, of how you carry out this energy review, and also the documentation of the results of the review. So we talked about performance indicators already. Performance indicators are a way of comparing energy performance before and after an improvement has been made. And as I said, the normal way to look at these is the key variable the thing that affects mostly the amount of energy that that process uses, that key variable becomes the performance indicator. Units of energy compared against that key variable. They have to be appropriate. They have to be able to demonstrate or capable of demonstrating that performance improvement has been achieved. And again, the way that you have chosen these and the way you set them out and the way they're structured has to be documented. So that's fairly straightforward, but this is one area where you really need to get it right if you are going to be able to demonstrate that you are making performance improvements. Just a little bit of a heads up, it's 20 to 2 and I'm about just over halfway through the slides I've got in front of me. So I'm guessing now we're going to run over by 5-10 minutes possibly, but I'm going to keep going. I've still got no questions, so I'm either baffling you completely, sent you all to sleep, or everything I'm saying is fully understandable. I'm hoping it's the last one. So I'm going to carry on, but just a reminder again, any questions that you've got as we're going through, fire them away, and we'll either deal with them there and then, or we will save them to the end. So energy baseline, clause 6.5. So the standard requires that you establish a baseline using the information from that energy review that we've just done about. Taking into account, the standard says a suitable period of time. Now, normally, we would expect a suitable period of time to be a 12-month period. Doesn't have to be a calendar 12 months. It can be a financial year. It can be, I work with a number of universities on this. They would use an academic year. Doesn't matter. But 12 months is normally what is considered appropriate. I've had a couple of people who've gone over that and maybe used a 2-year period as a baseline and then taken, if you like, an average figure across the 2 years. That's also equally acceptable, but generally probably 95% of people I've worked with take a 12-month period of some point. And what the standard says within the baseline is that you take this normalization of variables that can affect performance. So again, we're looking at not necessarily just how much energy you've used, so we've used X kilowatt hours, but we're also looking within this baseline for what that performance figure is. So if you're taking, say, 2018, sat here now as a baseline, then it would be in 2018, our energy performance in the office was 137 kilowatt hours per staff member, and that would be your baseline figure. However, having just said 2018, what I would strongly recommend is that there is one complete year and the baseline between where we are now and the year that you set, because you have to be able to demonstrate continual improvement. So at the moment, I would be looking for 2017 to be set as a baseline, which then allows a full year 2018 so that you can demonstrate that over that year, continual improvement has been made. If you've got 2018 as a baseline, we haven't yet got a full 12 months worth of figures in 2019 to make that comparison. That's just my tip, if you like, and I think that makes it easier to be able to demonstrate this continual improvement. We then have to come back and revise the baseline. It's not cast in concrete, if you like, or set in stone, whichever analogy you wish to use. The baseline needs to be revised in one of 3 areas. Again, this is lifted straight from the standard. So if the performance indicators you've chosen no longer reflect your energy performance, in other words, you're finding it hard to demonstrate continual improvement using the performance indicators you've set, you can, in certain circumstances, revisit that and say, well, actually, it might be better now to use this measure as opposed to that measure, because on reflection, the measure that we chose isn't necessarily the most suitable. That's one. There are major changes to the static factors. Now, we talked about the key variables. The other thing that the standard talks about are the static factors. So within heating, for instance, the variables are the temperature. The static factors are maybe the type of heating system we've got, maybe the type of aircon we've got in place, whatever. If we decide to replace our boilers, put in some more energy efficient boilers with maybe different types of energy efficient burners, etc., that is a change to the static factor. And then we would also then need to go back and revisit that baseline and say, what would the baseline look like now we've got these new static factors in place. Or some people do it according to a predetermined method, and maybe every period of time, every 2 or 3 years, they revisit that baseline. And then finally, one of the things that the whole standard, all these new standards now look at is a much greater emphasis on the term planning. And this standard, it's a much more proactive standard, and all the way through it talks about planning to do things. So this stage now is planning ahead and asking us to think about how we're going to plan to collect the data that we need. It's not about starting to plan it, that comes under clause 9, but how are we going to plan to actually collect that data? And there's a little bit of guidance in the boxes there that talk a little bit about the things that we might need to think about when we're planning, setting up an energy data collection plan. So for instance, some people might decide as part of this that there's a requirement for a better level of monitoring in terms of submetering. And that's quite often one of the things that people look at, that we can only measure something, we can only manage something if we can measure it, and in order to measure it properly, we might need to have a higher degree of submetering in place. I'm going to skip through clause 7 pretty quickly because there's very little change from any of the other standards, and indeed from the old standard. Clause 7.1's missing because it's resources, and I've already covered resources under leadership. Competency is just the same as the 2011 clause, so I'm not going to dwell on that. You have to determine the competency requirements of people involved in the system. Make sure that people are competent. The standard doesn't say you have to train people. The standard says they have to show a level of competence, which might include training, but there doesn't have to be formal training. And if people are not deemed to be competent or haven't got the competence that you will feel they should have, you have to allow them to achieve that, which might include a level of an awareness of training. Awareness, again, similar to the old standard, 2011 standard, people doing work under the organisation's control, that's your staff members, that's contractors, people working on your behalf, have to be aware of the policy and the commitments you've made, how the impacts of their work can impact on your energy performance, what they can do to contribute, and also the implications or risks of not conforming to the system's requirements. Communication, again, very little change. You need to establish a process on what you're going to communicate, how you're going to communicate, who are you going to communicate with. Communication externally and a bit of internal communication harks right the way back to clause 4.2, the needs of interested parties. If you've done that bit right, that should have identified some actual communication requirements. So I was just pausing slightly because there's a question just come in, which I will cover towards the end, if that's okay. It's a fairly technical question about measuring energy within a building, so we'll come back to that at the end. However, one of the key requirements now of this clause is there has to be a feedback mechanism so that anybody involved, whether it's visitors, whether it's staff, whether it's contractors, can suggest feedback or give feedback, can have input into improvements to the management system and indeed to energy performance. So we will look for a suggestion scheme, a way of people feeding in through either line management or whatever it is in terms of how they can perhaps help. Documented information, very quickly, this is just about making sure that we have got the documentation we need to demonstrate continual improvement, to have the documentation that the standards requires. If you've been listening, there's a couple of times I've actually said we need to be able to demonstrate this and have information to hand, but it doesn't have to be a manual. The standard doesn't say you need an energy manual. Most people do, but you don't have to have that. But whatever you've got needs to be controlled, available and protected. Now, sad person that I am, I sat down one day and went through the entire standard and pulled out the documentation that is absolutely required. So where the standard says you must hold something, it's on this table. The standard doesn't use the term documents and records, it just refers to documented information. However, I tend to still think of documents and records because they are slightly different. So if in the run up to an assessment, you can tick all of those boxes and say, yes, we've got all that documentation in place and it's all ready to show our assessor, you won't be going far wrong. I suggest that's a slide that you cut out and keep because it is really, really useful. Operational planning and control. This is really now putting into operation the things that we were planning to do that will allow us to control the energy that we use and will allow us to make improvements. So it's all about looking at these significant energy uses. What are the controls we've got? So again, if we're taking, for instance, a heating system, how do we manage the heating system? Who's got the control? How is it amended? Are there any parameters that we work within? How are we going to manage and control that? And if we don't have any criteria, then we need to maybe think about what the criteria is. So for instance, in an office, we may decide we're not going to have any heating on if the temperature is above, say, 21 degrees. We're not going to cool below, say, 24 degrees. And those tend to be the fairly standard figures that people would work to. But we may not have that formal criteria in place, and it's all about setting that criteria and then making sure that we have control of the processes, that we make sure that the processes are operating as effective as we can possibly make them. A couple of extra clauses in this standard compared to 14,001, and these two, 8.2 and the subsequent slide 8.3, tend to go hand in hand, and they are design and purchasing or procurement for energy efficiency. And we have to make sure that whatever we're buying, whatever processes we're designing, any new processes we've got, any new equipment we're buying, is partly bought on the basis of its energy performance. And that energy performance is not just at the time we buy it, we need to consider, if you like, whole life energy use. And again, one of the things we will look for is anything that you've been buying. If you've bought some new plants, some new equipment, if you're buying new fleets of vehicles, we will want to know now how you have taken energy performance into account when you purchase those. And again, it's no different to the requirements of the previous standards. So that's procurement and design. This slide and the subsequent slides are pretty quick. Again, it's 8 minutes to 2. So performance evaluation. Organizations must monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate your energy performance, including the system itself. So we talked about earlier, if you remember, under the end of clause 6, planning on what you're going to want to measure. This is now carrying out that plan, putting that plan into operation. How are we going to measure? Are we going to take meter readings? Do we need any special equipment? If so, does it need to be calibrated or verified? What's the criteria we're going to set? How are we going to carry out that monitoring? Who's going to do it? When is it going to be done, etc., etc. That's a whole raft of information on how we're going to collect the data that we need to be able to show and demonstrate our performance. Evaluation of compliance. This now rather bizarrely asks you to evaluate compliance with a clause that doesn't exist, although the requirements do exist, of course. It's all about evaluating conformity with legal and other requirements. That's the phrase the standard uses. It's either done by audit or done as a specific process whereby you make sure that all of the things that you promise you're going to do, all of the regulations, all of the legislation you have to comply with are being achieved, and you have to, importantly, maintain records that that process has been carried out. Internal audit is exactly the same as previously, exactly the same as any of the other standards. You have to have an audit process to verify that you're conforming to 50,001, but also to consider and verify the fact that you are improving your energy performance. Management review, no changes with one small exception from the previous standard. Standard requires inputs and of course associated outputs, but the important thing to remember, in the old standard, the management review was the place where you forecasted the sort of forward-looking energy performance. That's been taken out of the management review, and if you remember when I talked about the energy review, I said you to look back present and into the future, and that's where that now sits. And to me, that is a much more logical place to put that requirement. Other than that, the management review has remained the same. Now we come on to the interesting clause, and I'll try and get this covered in a minute or two. However, the standard requires that there is continual improvement in energy performance and in the system itself. Take the easy one first. So we have to consider opportunities for improvement and implement actions to achieve the intended outcomes of the standard, which is fine, which is that improvement clause. There is a focus on the system, but there is an equally bigger focus, if you like, on improving our energy performance, and that is one of the key requirements of the standard. So take it the easy one first. Non-conformities, we all know about those. We've got other standards in place. Nothing different here. We have to look at what's gone wrong. We have to take appropriate corrective action, and the actions that we take have to be consistent with the risk, if you like, of the issues. Now, this next little bit, I'm going to sort of slightly divert away from something here. There is a supplementary standard called ISO 50003, which isn't applicable to you, but applies to us as a certification body. And you'll see across the top there the title, and its requirements for bodies providing audit and certification. This standard made it clear that if an organisation does not demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance, and remember, performance, not absolute energy usage, that is a mandatory major non-conformance. And it's a very contentious issue, and it's one that's received quite a lot of publicity over the last year or two within the energy press particularly. Now, there's a number of people, I think of one particular consultant who I will not name, who has been going around saying that this is a new requirement. It is not. If you have a copy of the old 50001 standard, the 2011 standard, read clause 1. Clause 1 starts off by saying the whole idea of the standard is to achieve continual improvement in energy performance. It is not a new requirement. What is new is, if you like, the sanctions that are placed upon you for not doing that. And the sanction is a major non-conformance. So I'm going to skip through these a little bit, but energy performance improvement is defined as improvement in measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, or energy consumption compared to the energy baseline. So where you've set your baseline, we're looking for you to continually improve from that baseline point. And as it says there, a major non-conformance is audit evidence that energy performance was not improved. And it's a unique requirement within energy management systems. It's not the case in 14001. It's not the case in 9001. However, it is still an issue that has to be taken place. So therefore, it's something that we have to do, and we will try and work with you on this one. And in a number of cases, when this sort of things happen, what we try and look at, and we suggest you go back to have a look at, is the appropriateness of the performance indicators that you've chosen. Finally, and it's 2 minutes to 2, transition process. It is no different to the transition process that we've been through for the old standards, for the 9000 and 14001. All standards, all 2011 certificates, as I said, will expire in August 2021. And there are 3 ways of carrying out the transition. It can be done at a reassessment. So when you're due to have your recertification visit, if you like, that's how we would recommend it be done. It can be done at a surveillance. We've had a couple of people had that done already. When they've had the next surveillance visit, they've said they want to do the transition. Or it can be done at any time at all. We have achieved UCAS accreditation. We can carry out these transitions, and we've already done some, as I say, already. If you need any help, if you need any support, we can carry out pre-assessments. You'd need to speak to either myself or sales, or speak to your assessor. We can come in. It doesn't have a bearing on the certification, nor does it formally count towards the assessment time. So prior to a transition audit, you will be contacted. We say 30 days, but yeah, month or two before it's due. You will be sent, and I think we might have sent them out to everybody, but I think it's also available on our website. We have a transition gap analysis, just the same as we had for 9014. That has to be completed. That must be completed and possibly sent to your assessor before the visit, but certainly made available on the day. There needs to have been an internal audit carried out before the visit, which can be limited to the gap analysis, and there must have been a management review carried out prior to that transition. Right, oh, bang on 2 o'clock. So just a very, very quick summary before we get on to the one question I've got. So last chance for questions. Still only got the one question sent at the moment. Excuse me. So as a summary, the standard includes the adoption of Annex SL. The way of carrying out and the terminology for the energy review has been clarified a little bit. The method of what we call normalizing performance indicators, so the standard uses ENPIs, performance indicators, and ENB, if you see that use, that's energy baselines. So there's been a little bit more information. It's a little bit more structured, if you like, on those two areas. There's some clarifications on the energy data collection plan. That's a new area to plan for the data you're going to collect. And as I say, the text has been clarified, particularly on performance indicators and baselines, to provide a better understanding. So where next? I suggest that you use this to take a fresh look at your energy management system. Have a look at our website. There's a huge amount of information. I've written some gap analysis forms. There's some guidance, comparisons between the old standard and the new standard. There's quite a bit of information on there that you can use. Look at the key changes and use those key changes as an opportunity to make improvements. Make changes to the documentation to reflect the new structure. Make sure that you've implemented the new requirements on leadership, on risk and context. Look at the controls you've got in place. Look at how you're currently managing things. Are they effective? Do they need to be modified or improved? Start out with the assumption that every control may have to be changed unless you can define that it is suitable. But most importantly, carry out this gap analysis. It will help you. It will guide you through the process, but it's also a mandatory part of what we need to see. Apologies, I've gone 2.5 minutes over. I will just now come back to this one question from Roger. With regard to performance where there is minimal staff in large buildings, where there is possibility to, hang on, it's just gone, where there is possibility to improve performance, can it be measured in kilowatt hours per square meter? Of course it can. It could be measured in anything you particularly choose. If you look at energy performance certificates, they're the things that you get for new buildings, new houses. You also see them now. These are the ones that have an A to G rating. That figure on there, the energy performance is quoted in kilowatt hours per square meter. So if you want to use that, absolutely, yes, you can. You can choose whatever measure you like, so long as it's deemed to be relevant and it gives a good measure of performance. Now, a couple of people already left, and I understand that. It's 3.5 minutes past 2. Very, very quickly, one last call for questions. I'm going to start wrapping up now. So don't forget, you will get a copy of the presentation emailed to you as a PDF next week. You will also ultimately be able to access a recording of this on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, my name is Richard Walsh. I don't mind you emailing me. My email address is richard.walsh, it's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh@nqa.com. If you're an NQA client, I thank you for that. If you're not an NQA client, we'd be, of course, more than happy to talk to you. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it relevant. I thank you for your time. And it's Friday afternoon. We're half a day from the weekend. Have a good afternoon, have a good weekend, and thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.